exaggerated claim. There are authors on both sides of that debate. So I'm winding down now the first third of my talk. If you're following the outline from numeral 1, we're approaching the end here. And let me just make this final note that I think it's safe to say the following thesis statement. It's no longer a question whether we globalize. That seems inevitable. The question now is how we globalize. A few years ago, I wrote an article, I have a copy of it here, an article called Judging the Juggernaut. The URL link to that is in the very middle of your outline page there if you want to look up this article that I wrote. It's a bit getting old now, but I think it still says a few good things. I chose the word juggernaut advisedly and quite carefully. A juggernaut, if you know the Hindu god Vishnu, it's one of the incarnations of that god which demands fierce loyalty from all of its followers. So the word juggernaut in American slang just means any strong, irresistible force. I would argue that globalization, too, is an irresistible force. There's really no way to turn the clock back, to go back to an age of pre-globalization, whatever that would mean. I mean, there's been globalization ever since the time of, I don't know, Marco Polo, or maybe even the Roman Empire. People have always had these interchanges. Admittedly, they're at the highest level of global interchange ever, where something like 1 in 6 products crosses a national border between the time that it's produced and the time that it's actually consumed. So this is something to think about. So juggernaut, an irresistible force. I would argue that globalization is such an irresistible force. There's really nowhere in the world you can go to avoid globalization. There's no backwater where you can kind of huddle together in a corner and avoid globalization. There were globalization protesters in places like Seattle back in '99, Davos, Switzerland on a few occasions. I think there was a big protest in Genoa, Italy in the summer of 2002, and others you might be aware of. Those were led by anti-globalizers. Many of them had excellent values, standing up for the environment, for local cultures, etc. But I don't think it's wise to join them in an utter kind of knee-jerk reaction against all things that smack of globalization. Rather, I would like to see, as an ethicist, I would like to see the question directed to this question. How are we to globalize? In what ways and with what protocols and procedures can we perhaps make the most socially responsible approach to globalization? How can we shape globalization so that it serves human needs? So that market forces are not the only thing that we think about and that we work with. We're moving towards an era of freer and freer trade. The question then becomes, can we also move to an era of fairer and fairer trade? Can people in the less developed countries benefit at least marginally, perhaps as strongly as the first world people do, who control the terms of trade? Can we find a way to arrange our world trade arrangements, our institutions, so that that might happen? Let me close this first third of my talk with a quote from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. And mark these words, because you're going to hear Pope John Paul II saying very similar things in just a minute. A few years ago, Kofi Annan said this about globalization. Let us choose to unite the power of markets with the authority of universal ideals. Let us choose to reconcile the creative forces of private entrepreneurship with the needs of the disadvantaged and the requirements of future generations. The point of Kofi Annan's quote is, let's shape globalization so that it serves people, not just the economy. It's no coincidence that the second part of my talk, what Catholic social teaching has said so far, echoes many of those same sentiments of Kofi Annan. Let me say just a bit about my own brief research on Catholic social teaching on globalization. A few years ago, I was invited to write that article that I mentioned, Judging the Juggernaut, and I started looking around like every good scholar does. What has been said in Catholic social teaching documents about the topic of globalization? And I found less than I thought I would. The Catholic social teaching tradition consists of a series of Vatican encyclicals and other documents that are similar to papal encyclicals, and of course local teachings of conferences of bishops in 108 different regions or countries around the world. relevant to an analysis, I really found quite a dearth. I did find 13 occasions on which John Paul II said something about globalization, but most of those were very sketchy. In fact, the longest sustained statement is about 2 pages long, about 5 long paragraphs. He did address globalization a bit in his 1991 encyclical letter, Centesimus Annus, but that came at the very beginning of 1991, of the decade that really made globalization what it is today. So those observations are a bit dated. So 13 papal statements, and I found 11 other documents from different Catholic sources, as diverse as the German Bishops' Conference, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, Pax Christi, the International Peace Movement, the Center of Concern, a think tank in Washington, D.C., a few religious institutes like my own order, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. So putting those 13 papal statements together with the 11 other Catholic documents, you come up with an interesting picture, a portrayal, a pretty balanced portrayal, of the positives and the negatives of globalization, the opportunities that it creates and the risks that it presents and confronts us with. The 2 most common phrases that I found in John Paul II's commentary on globalization are these, and they're on your sheets there. The first, the humanization of globalization, something that John Paul II is calling for, to make it serve human needs. And secondly, the globalization of solidarity. Solidarity being one of the Pope's favorite words when he turns his attention to the socio-economic and political sphere of life. On your sheets, I printed 2 brief quotes from John Paul II. I'll read them briefly here. His World Day of Peace message in the year 2000 read in part as follows: globalization, for all its risks, also offers exceptional and promising opportunities, precisely with a view to enabling humanity to become a single family, built on the values of a single family, built on the values of justice, equity, and solidarity. About a year later, in an address to the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, John Paul II said this: globalization a priori is neither good nor bad. It will be what people make of it. It is necessary to insist that globalization, like any other system, must be at the service of the human person. It must serve solidarity and the common good. If you're a student of Catholic social teaching or even have passing familiarity with it, these sentences will not come as any surprise. The basic goals of solidarity and of the common good have been a constant in Catholic social teaching for as long as we've had Catholic social teaching, somewhere approaching 115 years. But note with me, if you were to read more of the literature of globalization from Catholic sources, note that there are a number of fascinating verbs, and I'm going to list here 10, they're printed on your outline sheets, that I kept running into. And here's my list of 10 verbs. What do we need to do with globalization? We need to harness, tame, control, bridle, yoke, curb, circumscribe, domesticate, discipline, and restrain. Do you find a pattern in these verbs? There's a certain underlying metaphor lurking beneath these verbs. The metaphor is as if globalization is like a wild animal. These forces of the market economy around the world are rampaging like a wild animal, and we need to rein it in a little bit. We need to control it. We need to turn possibly dangerous forces that could hurt people into positive forces that will only help people. This is a place where both economists on one hand and theologians like myself on the other hand can work together to try to come to an adequate understanding of globalization, and then hopefully to tame those forces to make it serve the positive good, to manage globalization in a humane way.